Thank you, Megan. As we go through, please feel free to put questions in the chat at any point, particularly when Beth is speaking, and Beth will be speaking first. She's going to throw some questions out. Please feel free to respond in the chat and we'll make sure that we read them out. Okay, so this session is called Curlews and Social Science. And if you've joined our webinars before, you'll know that we use the curlew, if you like, as a Trojan horse within which to sort of wheel in lots of the big issues to do with conservation. And curlews are, if you could, poster bird for a lot of the big crises that we face. Everything from climate change to farming to forestry to habitat loss to predators, whatever it is, we can look at the big issues of conservation through curlews. And I think the more we understand these issues, the better we'll do our conservation. This session is about curlews and social science. We've done a lot on the sort of conservation science of things, but this is about the social science, something that is, as I said earlier, very, very close to my heart, because conservation doesn't just happen in a field or in a nature reserve, it actually happens in society, and society is intricately intertwined with conservation. So I'm delighted that we've got tonight who will cover this really well and broadly, and I hope that you'll join in with the conversation afterwards. Our speakers, I'll just very quickly introduce them at the top level. We have Beth Brockett, who is the scientific arm of the Forestry Commission, Forestry Research. Beth is a social scientist working in conservation. I have Barry McMahon, who's an associate professor in wildlife conservation at University College Dublin. And Barry and I go way back to 2016, where he was one of the first people I met on my curlew walk when I was walking across Ireland, and was incredibly helpful in setting up the conference that we did in 2016. And Charles Foster, the author and academic fellow of Exeter College at Oxford, in the Department of Law, an author, an ethicist, and a vet, and about 100 other things as well, and probably one of the most exciting writers in the field of wildlife and nature that I know of. So we will go straight to Beth. Beth is going to give us the overview of the relationship between social science and conservation. So over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Mary. And I thought I'll start without the slides because I've been asked to give a bit of a background on myself and my professional journey. So I'll do that without some slides so I can see you all. So thanks for inviting me. As Mary said, I work for Forest Research. I'm a senior social scientist. Forest Research, we cover England, Scotland and Wales, and we're the main provider of forest-related science in Great Britain. So a bit of my background. There's been an environmental science theme running throughout my training. I had a range of disciplinary focuses. I did an undergraduate in environmental sciences, which was quite broad, did some postdocing in social sciences, and then my master's was actually in forest soil microbial ecology, which is where I had my revelation while sieving soil in a lab, that I probably wanted to speak to people a bit more, and the answer was really with the people. So I from my master's in forest soil microbial ecology, I went into community development with groundwork, and then an interdisciplinary PhD which combined soil science, ecology and social science. I then became a farm advisor and responsible officer for Natural England, and that's where my closest relationship to curlews came, because I was a responsible officer for several SSSIs in the Peak District, and curlews were a key part of that work and trying to use agri-environment schemes to manage their habitat. Then I became a social scientist in Natural England in 2017, and now I've moved into forest research. So that's a potted history of my background. And as Mary said, I encourage you to ask questions as we go along in the chat. Mary's going to let me know when we run out of time, because I'm sort of going to keep this sort of, there'll be points where I stop and sort of ask for some of your feedback and actually ask you for a bit of where you want me to go with the next direction in what I'm going to talk about. So yes, be primed over your keyboards and I'll share my slides. So what is environmental social science and why do we need it? it's increasingly recognised as a key part in policy, in evidence-based policy and evidence-based practice. I actually have been running a research project for quite a few years now with a variety of colleagues, social science colleagues from across different environment agencies and government departments, which looks at this increased interest in social science, and looks at how we're increasing in capacity, but also in terms of impact and what we do, because a lot of organisations are, a lot of the time their mission statements are incorporating people more explicitly. There's just more understanding that in the world we live in with the complex environmental issues that we have to consider people. So what is social science? It's a contested question. And a lot of what I'm going to draw on for the next few slides is from the Access project, which is a project led by Exeter and Surrey universities and including partners from Forest Research and lots of other agencies and government departments, which is looking at the role of social sciences within the sector and how to give us more leverage and impact. And I'll provide some links in a bit, and I'm sure the slides can be circulated. So why do we need social sciences? Environmental issues are ultimately social issues. They're caused by, understood by, and must be solved by people. And those people could be looked at as individuals, groups, communities, and political and institutional systems. And securing the future of our planet and the well-being of humankind requires an in-depth understanding of how those relationships are interdependent and how they link between people and also between the social and natural people and the social and natural environment. And it requires knowledge and expertise of all environmental social sciences, which I'll get to in a second. So I'm interested in knowing what you think. Please put in the chat. I can't actually see the chat now, Megan and Mary, so it would be great if when I stop you could read some of the things out, because as I said, I can't see the chat at all or anyone. So I'm interested to know what you think of the following definitions and the rationales for social science. So as one definition, environmental social science is the systematic study of the interrelationship between three dynamic components: people. You can see a cog of people on the diagram, their actions, thoughts and experiences as individuals, as decision makers, consumers and citizens. The social environment, which includes existing social norms, values, cultures, institutions, political systems and social processes. And the natural, a non-human environment, including, and there's a whole discussion about whether we're part of nature or not, I won't go in there now, but that includes natural resources, for example, energy, water, clean air, the climate, biodiversity, environmental processes and problems. So that's one definition that the Access Partnership has come up with for environmental social science. And environmental social scientists can be found in academia, in research institutes, consultancies, non-governmental organisations, in policy and practice organisations, including government departments and arm's length bodies, and in local and devolved governments. We're all over the place and we're growing in number. And environmental social scientists may have received training in a range of classical social science disciplines, like psychology, sociology, anthropology, economics, applied disciplines like education and marketing, and interdisciplinary fields like human ecology. And this is an exhaustive list on the screen now. It's some of it's from UKRI, and I've added a few in of my own. And each discipline tends to adopt different types of research approaches, theories and models, and they can be complementary. And the units of analysis may also vary. So individual consumers, social groups, politics, power, and the analytical methods can vary between disciplines. So it could be qualitative, could be quantitative, could be mixed methods, could look at big data, case study analyses, spatial analyses, and also the types of relationships that are studied, for example, causal relationships, correlational relationships, more systemic relationships. So it's quite a large set of fields, as you can see. And I probably would class myself as a human geographer from my foundations, but working in an arm's length body, and there not being traditionally that many of us, you tend to have to be a little bit of a jack of all trades. So what can environmental social sciences do for you? So I've put some resources at the bottom of this slide from the Access Network, including a link to a webinar on why we need environmental social sciences, and there's going to be more added, including the definition that I've talked to you about this month. And I think it's also worth knowing that the Access website has a database of social scientists, including their specialisms and contact details. So I won't go into sort of this slide in great depth, but just to say there are lots of different roles social scientists can perform, including practical insights, diagnosis of issues, and also suggestions for solutions, and critique and innovation, providing novel perspectives. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen before I move on to my final slide, which is sort of a bit more specific about the types of social science that can help curlews and the wider environment. So just to see if there's any comments on those definitions or any questions anyone had about those definitions.
There was just somebody who wants access to those so they can think about it. Which
yes, of course, yeah. I'm putting you all on the spot, rather.
Yes. I think people
fine.
are trying to get their heads around the big ideas at the moment.
Yeah, that's fine. Oh, thanks for that,
Sharing
Megan.
2 links, yeah.
Brilliant.
Just make it a bit easier for people.
I'll let people carry on thinking, and I'll just share my sort of penultimate slide, which is basically, can you see that now? Yeah. My penultimate slide, if it will move on. Oh, there we go. You probably all know what that is. That's an image from Natural England, but I was just going to put out here I had a brainstorm of some of the types of social science research and the types of questions that we can ask, which might be of benefit to Curlew, but more broadly as well. So social sciences can help understand and influence land manager, understand land manager behaviours, but also how we, as in policymakers or practitioners, advisors, can influence those behaviours and support farmers to make more environmentally, or other land managers, local authorities, make more positive environmental improvements to their land. We can explore tensions when managing for different land management priorities, understanding and mitigating for human wildlife conflicts, valuing species and habitats and ecosystem processes, and that can be done from an economic perspective, but also from social and cultural values perspective. Exploring benefits certain habitats, species and landscapes have for human well-being, sense of place. Working with different types of knowledge. So Western scientific knowledge isn't the only type of knowledge that we should be thinking about when we're talking about conservation. Best practice in citizen science. Citizen science is a great tool and power for good, but there's some really important ways you can do it well. Understanding how evidence is used within policy making. So we can produce all the evidence we need in the world, but if it's not getting through to the policymakers and practitioners that will be actioning it, then we're not going to get much further along. And that includes things like policy evaluation, and there's something called social policy evaluation. Understanding the role of advice and guidance in managing for curlew and other habitats. How we communicate about curlew and about the environment in general. That's moves into the sort of sphere of science communication, which I'd say isn't necessarily a social science, but certainly social sciences can support understanding audiences and understanding how messages get received and actioned. So I thought I would, I've got about, I think if I'm right, about 3.5 minutes left. So I thought I'd just open it up and see if anyone wants to explore any of those in more detail, or wants me to talk about any of those in more detail.
Someone has said, Beth, does your definition of a social scientist include anthrozoology, which is a term actually I don't know.
Very possibly. I've not really, I mean, I can guess where the sort of origins are, but I've not heard of it before. So yes, I'm assuming it probably does. But Keith, I don't know any anthrozoologists, so I'll be interested to know more.
I do have a question from me actually, Beth. It's just all these different sorts of social scientists. where do they train? Where do they get their understanding of the relationship between social science and conservation? Are there courses on it? And when it comes to conservation, how are they paid for, if you like, as a part of a project? Are they increasingly folded into the sort of costing of a project, or how does it work?
I mean, in terms of training, I mean, that's probably very similar routes to how natural scientists are trained, really. There's a wealth of social science courses and degrees and things out there. I mean, some people take more of a general social sciences route and move into environment. So there's quite a few people that sort of started out as physical or natural environmental scientists like myself and moved into the social sciences. There's actually been some as part of the Access project, Natural England colleagues, we did a project where we tried to pull together a lot of resources to help our colleagues. It was mainly to help our colleagues, but it's also sort of interested others. What sort of training materials are out there to help people understand what social sciences are, how, sort of the foundations of some foundational sort of methods and approaches to social science, and I can certainly put that in the chat a bit later on if people are interested. So yeah, we're trained like any other scientist. We have our own sets of professional standards and systematic ways of approaching things, and that will vary slightly between disciplines, as I mentioned. In terms of how social scientists are funded, we now include, so for example, Natural England has a whole chief scientist directorate. There's now around 15 social scientists as part of that. Forest research has always been quite advanced in this area. We've got 20 plus social scientists and had a number of them for many years. But as I said, more and more organisations are finding that they're employing social scientists, or certainly at the very least they're commissioning social science research, which may be from the likes of Forest Research, or it might be from academic organisations. And something that I'm finding increasingly, which is a breath of fresh air, is that we're not just being brought in at the end to socialise the findings of our natural science colleagues, because that's a big bugbear of most social scientists. You'll find that we're brought in from the beginning to help formulate the questions that need to be asked and the people that need to be asked. So yeah, I'm pleased that we're becoming more part of the scientific endeavour.
Thank you very much. That's okay. That's great. And Keith Cowison, who asked the question about anthrozoology. Anthrozoology spans the humanities and the social, behavioural and biomedical sciences. That's what anthrozoology is. So that's a term I didn't know. Quite interesting. Okay. Thank you. That was a nice big overview, a very broad overview of all the different areas that that social scientists can contribute to conservation. So now I want to move on. Before we develop that conversation further, I'd really like to move on to Barry McMahon. As I said, Barry is an associate professor at University College Dublin, working in wildlife conservation, particularly in agriculture, and you sit in the Department of Agriculture. And Barry, I think, as I said earlier, you and I go back to 2016 and the very first ever all-Ireland Curlew conference, which came out of the Curlew Walk. So over to you to tell us how social science played into that.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Mary, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about, I suppose, Curlew and people in an Irish context. I don't want to be here under false pretenses. I am very much a natural scientist in terms of my activities, but I'm really critically aware of the fact that if you want to implement any conservation, that you need to understand how people think, which is quite obvious. And that's why I sort of harness the social scientists. I don't bring them in at the end, Beth, don't worry. I can say that this work was done in collaboration with Juliet Young, who's very much a social scientist, and we planned this from the beginning, and also a student of mine called Amy McCluskey. And as I said, this is, I suppose, a reflective talk on a stakeholder-driven conference that we had as a result of Mary's walk in 2014. So I met Mary in May 2016, I should say, and we had the conference in November 2016. So I can give you some of the progress from that date onwards and some of the barriers, and I'll briefly discuss, you know, the potential and opportunities and the stumbles that we've had along the way. And I'd like to think, given the information that Beth has given you, that this is maybe some sort of an exemplar of what you were talking about, particularly in your last slide. So hopefully I'll hit on some of those and they'll resonate with some of you who are listening. So Curlew have been in critical decline for 30 years up to 2016, and I mean by critical decline I mean 97%. So the evidence around that was comparisons between data collected in 1993, and then a survey was put together using, or the information was put together using the Atlas data from Balmer, which any of you who are interested in ornithology across Britain and Ireland, you will be familiar with that book, and you could see the declines across that. And there was many an effort to highlight those declines. So our NGO, Birdwatch Ireland, continually lobbied government in relation to the response of to the situation, and they publicised this decline in terms of letters to the minister, in terms of the Curlew appeal, and there were certain actions that were put in place in relation to publicising this in terms of, I mean, this is just one of the numerous popular pieces of press. So this is just a broadsheet newspaper where the decline of the Curlew was highlighted. But interestingly enough, I mean, what I've found in conversations with Juliet is that it can be really difficult to actually get these declines to resonate with public or even with stakeholders. And there were further sort of implementation exercises put in place. So there was an interreg, so a cross-border project put in place between RSPB and Birdwatch Ireland. There was also agri-environmental schemes that Beth was talking about earlier in terms of for facilitating, you know, specific conservation actions, and they were aimed at helping Curlew, but the efficacy wasn't particularly there. And you can see, you know, some of the leaflets that were produced out of that Curlew interreg project, and these were the sort of the pieces of information or the pieces of communication that were sort of trying to tap into the general public or into maybe stakeholders who mightn't be as interested in avian conservation or bird conservation. So this was the way in which they were trying to get this message across. So, you know, there was a national survey carried out in 2015, and that was sort of where the real reality hit between 2015, 2017, and that coincided with Mary's walk. So through that, we were able, I suppose, to action a response where we could actually get all the sort of stakeholders, all the willing stakeholders, and let's be honest, you know, Mary will vouch for this, some of the not so willing stakeholders were leveraged into turning up to a place in Westmeath in Ireland, and we were able to sort of get everyone in a room together, and out of that we were able to produce a document which sort of planned a way forward in relation to how we should respond to the Curlew situation. I mean, a 97% decline over a 30-year period is massive, and that was over my lifetime as well, because I remember seeing Curlew when I was fishing in the west of Ireland. I remember them quite vividly, and I went back about 15 years later and they were gone. So it was something that was very obvious to me. So it sort of it hit at many different levels as a life scientist, yes, but also as a sort of a living, breathing conservationist who has emotions, it was something that resonated with me. And that was one of the benefits, and that's one of the reasons why Mary uses this species, because it is a creature, actually, once people are exposed to it in any way, shape or form, it's a very, very easy sell in terms of getting people to buy into it. And that was one of the benefits of the process. So we had this stakeholder driven workshop. We had over 80 stakeholders responsible for curlew conservation and management in Ireland, which gives you a sense of the enormity of the challenge, but also the range of different people that were involved. And we just carried out a student project to look at the interviews of 10 of those stakeholders to obtain motives as to what their, what was driving them in terms of their attendance at the project, at the meeting, what they wanted to see out of it, and just to get a sense, I suppose, of what the hearts and minds of the stakeholders was. So we asked them 3 very simple questions, and so the first question was, why did you want to attend the workshop? And broadly speaking, what most people said was they had a sort of a conscious desire, they had an overriding desire to actually do something to save the bird, which was a very, very good start. And then one of the main sort of questions that we wanted to find out was, what did the stakeholders think were the barriers to the conservation of the creature? And for many of them, it relates back to what Beth's last slide was. It related to land use, and it related to funding. And land use policy in relation to conservation is a fundamental building block. And then I suppose a really sort of pertinent question was, from a socio-economic perspective, why is it taken so long for Ireland to react? So all that information about Birdwatch Ireland, all the different letters, all the different newspaper articles, all the rest. And the main sort of response was that our government are slow to fulfil its obligations in relation to halting the decline of biodiversity, and that people are concerned, but not concerned enough to do something. And again, that goes back to one of the points that we mentioned earlier, and that relates to leverage. Okay, so we cannot leverage the people that matter in relation to actually eliciting a response. And the social science tools, and anyone can correct me on this, this is where the social science tools really come into it, in terms of understanding values, in terms of understanding incentives, in terms of understanding motives. So the major sort of conclusion from the workshop was interesting. And this is something that really needs to be taken in context, all right? So when you look at any set of circumstances, you need to look at the context within which it operates. So one person pointed this out, and again, this was something that was across the stakeholders. They wanted curlew and conservation of peatlands or any other sort of conservation action to go from a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down. So they, and maybe that relates to the hearts and minds of Irish people in terms of the fact that we don't like to be told what to do, that we're better off organising ourselves from the bottom and organising things like co-ops, etc., etc. But this is really important, I think, because this is where the people aspect comes in. So the context is going to vary from location to location, and as life scientists, and some of you may or may not agree with this, particularly as researchers, we're always looking for universal applications of big findings that are applicable across wide areas. But in terms of conservation, often the power of context at a very, very specific level, even like at a parish level or a local level, is a really critical thing to be able to tap into in order to have efficacy. So since then, we produced a sort of paper on this, and this is available online for as open access if any of you want to have a look at it. And it basically, I could say go off and read it. It's a fantastic read, but I've basically just summarized it in those last couple of slides. But if there's a little bit more context or a little bit more detail you want to get around it, feel free to download it for as open access. So following on for that, there was, if you could just go back, please, there was a couple of actions that were put in place, or a couple of activities. There was a Curlew task force put in place. There was a Curlew conservation program, which just finished up last year. And there was a survey which estimated that the Curlew population was about 105 pairs. So it had dropped again from about 130 pairs to 105 in a period of about 6 years. And there have been a couple of, there's a student working with me doing a PhD on Curlew genomics, and there's a large sort of breeding wader European innovation partnership which focuses around Curlew, and there's a social science aspect where we're looking at sort of predator management and how people, I suppose, deal with predator management as a positive and a negative, because you know the views around that are many and varied. So it's really important that we deal with that and that we respect that, bearing in mind that this is a huge issue around conservation of ground nesting birds, including Curlew. So this is the project that's ongoing at the moment. It started this year and it's due to go on for 5 years. It's a massive project involving many different aspects, an element of research, but mainly the main element is integrating activity with farmers and stakeholders in terms of producing what we would call sort of on the ground actions. And you can see along the bottom, maybe you mightn't recognize the emblems, but it's multidisciplinary in terms of the various different stakeholders that are involved in delivering the project, and it's sort of jointly funded by 2 different government departments in Ireland, which is quite a progression in terms of our National Parks and Wildlife Services and the Department of the Environment and the Department of Agriculture and Marine, which is, as I say, you know, the integration of those 2 aspects is really important, because many of our Curlew are being found on food producing landscapes, if you like. So this is just, I suppose, my natural science or my life science approach in terms of my reflection on the last number of years of work in this space, that, you know, we can have all the talking, we can have all the research, we can have all the actions, but ultimately, as many of the stakeholders and I will judge, the measure of success in relation to Curlew conservation in Ireland will be judged by the breeding population. That's the way that I would judge it. I'm really sort of gone beyond the idea of sort of externalities and positive spin-offs in relation to this. I've been working in conservation for 20 years, so I want to see results. I don't want to see talking shops, etc., etc. So that's maybe a colder, maybe bringing it back more to sort of the life sciences outcomes. So with that, I'll push on to the last slide, and if you have any questions or you have any comments or criticisms, I'm happy to deal with them. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. Very powerful presentation there. And from someone who spent quite a bit of time in Ireland, and even back then, wasn't it, in 2016, I think we were working on 150 pairs. I remember a slide going up, and now we're down to 105, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was under 100 this year. So it really is a heartbreak place in terms of Curlew, and the crisis is absolutely in your face. It's hard to sort of get your head around that we're watching the disappearance of Curlew from Ireland on our watch, but I feel that we might. And so it's even more important that we engage every single person and every single person does have a role to play, whether you're a landowner or whether you're a scientist or whether you're just somebody who lives in the centre of Dublin. Everybody can do something, and that's why social science, the social science approach. Just before we move on to Charles, how important do you think it is, Barry, that the Curlew has a cultural significance in Ireland, or does it have a cultural significance in Ireland?
Yeah, it certainly does have a cultural significance. in terms of it being a creature that was always present, in terms of the type of agriculture that existed up until, you know, the late 80s and 90s. So from that perspective, amongst a certain generation, and you would have heard a lot of these stories, and it's reflected in your book, where there are people who would talk about the loss of Curlew, and it certainly does. But you know, this is sort of like the dripping of the tap as we move on from generation to generation. I mean, what 9 or 10-year-old has seen a Curlew in Ireland? And that's the important part. And in fairness, members of the project are trying to do that. But so it does have a massive impact. And I mean, we've talked about this the other day as well. One of the things that I think is really, really important, and Curlew are a good way of doing it, is we need to explain simply and clearly as to why biodiversity loss is important. You know, even with things like the Living Planet Index, which is one number and it shows critical declines, it doesn't seem to resonate with people. But maybe if you can use a species like Curlew that does occur in some people's back garden, or used to occur in some people's back garden, it might be another way of doing it, of approaching that. As we've discussed before, I don't think myself or my life science or even social science colleagues are necessarily the best people to spin that story or to get it across. I do maybe with 90 or so students in a lecture theatre, but I think it's much more powerful for people who are better storytellers than I am in terms of resonating and hitting those buttons in relation to you know, what elicits a response from individuals or populations. Yeah. That's just my reflections on it.
Yeah, absolutely, Barry. And it was very obvious walking across Ireland, you know, the poem you showed up in your, you know, we put on the back of the agenda was a poem that a guy just stopped by the side of the road when I was walking, he sort of screeched to a halt and said, "I've been looking for you. I heard you were walking for Curlews. My dad, who's died now, wrote this poem about them. I want you to have it." You know, there was an old guy who I chatted to in the centre of Ireland. We talked about Curlews, and he said, "Oh, I haven't heard of them for a long time." And then I played in the call and he immediately started to cry, you know, said, "My God, that takes me right back to my childhood," and all that kind of stuff. There's a very emotional underbed with the Curlew, which you can't necessarily say for all species. So we need to leverage that word you've used a few times.
Yeah, there's one thing that I do realise before I don't want to pause too long, as I want Charles to get in. I think it's really important for us to realise that, you know, we are all talking to one another.
Yeah.
You know, but we always talk about it here in terms of the farmer, the hard to reach farmer. They're the individuals that we need to be getting to. We need to get to the hard to reach but influential individuals, and you know, target those. You know, that's just a sort of a cold reflection, because we're not quite resonating the way that we need to be.
Completely. Thanks very much, Barry. Lots of food for thought. On to you, Charles. Like I said, Charles is fellow of Exeter College in Oxford and has, I mean, you couldn't write on one piece of paper the number of things that Charles does and has achieved. So an academic, a writer, a vet, a lawyer, an ethicist. And the reason that Charles is speaking to us today is I read Charles's book called On Being a Human. And Being a Human was very affecting for me. I thought it was a wonderful book, very brave, very creative, very different. And there was so much in there. I've got reams of notes. Just every time I sat down to read it, I had to write some more notes. We'll be going into that in hopefully a bit more detail. But suffice to say, Charles is here because all this is about people. And from everything that you do, Charles, you seem to understand how we've evolved and is how we've evolved. Working, are we conservationists by evolution, or are we working against it? I'd really like you to give us an overview of your view of what it is to be a human in a challenged, conservationally challenged world.
Thank you so much, Mary, for the invitation. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Barry, for your contributions. And I'm going to be a bad guest and a rude guest by beginning by saying that I'm really suspicious of social science. And the reason I'm suspicious of social science is because individual humans are completely mysterious and incalculable. The greatest writer that there has ever been, Shakespeare, is great because he knew that. Shakespeare's kings are not kingly. Shakespeare knows that lovers kill their beloved. Shakespeare's fools are the ones who are wise. He knows that we are creatures who are made of dust, who think that we're made of light, and who often behave as if we're made of dung. He knows that we are pigs and angels. He asks repeatedly in everything that he says that resonant question of the psalmist, what is man that thou art mindful of him? And you'll remember the answer that the psalmist gives. He made you a little lower than the angels. Well, we often behave very, very much lower than the angels, but sometimes behave rather higher than the angels as well. We are strange beings. But social science is the study of cohorts. I accept that in cohorts, individuals behave in predictable, describable, calculable ways. But that's the root of my suspicion of social science. For the only justification for society, it would seem to me, is that it helps individuals to be more individual. And therefore, because humans are incalculable, it helps individuals to be more incalculable. It worries me that to describe the characteristics of a society makes individuals less themselves, because we have a wish to conform and to belong. And we might think that because the sociologists tell us that humans have, judged on the basis of a cohort, a certain set of characteristics, it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. All that said, I do think that we can perhaps learn something about the sorts of creatures that we are from a look, as Mary's hinted, at our evolutionary past. We go back a long way. We have been anatomically identical to the creatures that we are now for hundreds of thousands of years, but something significant, tectonic, happened about 45,000 years ago at the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic. Then is the start of what's called behavioral modernism. So we start to see indications in the archaeological record of behavior which is identical to ours. We can talk later if you want about the sorts of behaviors that is. But basically, you and I, are there from 45,000 years ago. Depending on how you do the calculation, between 90 and 95% of our time as humans has been, behaviorally modern humans that is, has been spent in that Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherer phase. And how was that characterized? It was characterized in a number of ways which have been parodied and romanticized, but it does seem to be associated with a porosity. We bled into the natural world and the natural world bled into us. We didn't see the distinction between us and the non-human world, which came later at the time of the Neolithic. We describe ourselves in terms of personal pronouns. I have used the word I hundreds of times already in just the last couple of minutes. But how did that happen? Well, some of you may know the work of the South African anthropologist David Lewis-Williams, who talks about the importance of altered states of consciousness. The idea is that in these altered states of consciousness, whether they were induced by plant hallucinogens or by dancing around a campfire until you're dehydrated, we got out of our own minds, we went into other worlds. There we met with non-human animals. We transmuted ourselves into their. Remember the animal-human hybrids which are on those glorious cave paintings at Chauvet in Altamira, and with the perspective that our entrance into those non-human bodies gave us, we were able to look back at ourselves and we were able to say for the first time, that's Charles Foster. It makes sense to use a personal pronoun of him. And if I can see me in that way, which previously I wasn't able to do, I'm able to see you. I can see I can say thou. And if you have those two things in your vocabulary, you can start doing something really important. You can start telling stories. So right from the beginning of what we are, we became quintessentially storytelling animals. We can't stop telling stories. They're the only things, I suggest, which compels us, the only thing which is going to change us, because we are stories ourselves. I heard Barry talk about that horrid figure of 97% decline of curlews. I know what I'm supposed to feel about that figure, but I can't, because it's an abstraction. It's too distant from me. But if you told me a story about the death of a single curlew at the end of my road, which I had seen, which perhaps I had stroked if it had been caught, it would be very different. That would change my gut. I would be able to weave that into my story, and because it was part of my story, I would be prepared to do something about it in the way that the most depressing graph about curlew decline is not going to make me do. We then moved into the Neolithic phase. Where it happened and when it happened varies a lot. But what happened then is that we lost our porosity. We started to see the natural world not as something of which we were part, but as a resource. We started to see it as part of the environment, something which is around us. One of the changes I'd like to make to the way that we discuss these things is to outlaw the word environment. The environment talks about what's outside us, and that's a very Neolithic way of looking at the non-human world. No, the wild is inside us. It's literally inside us. We're composed substantially of uncontrolled and uncontrollable bacteria and fungi and viruses. We are ecosystems, and we should talk about ourselves as ecosystems. This is scientifically trite, but it hasn't yet filtered into the way we think about the world. And then at the Enlightenment, there came another really important change. Up until then, we had seen the natural world as essentially ensouled. This was Aristotle's great contribution to describe exactly the way in which we saw that ensoulment. So he saw humans as having elevated souls, animals having not quite so elevated souls, plants having even less elevated souls, but still, even though you had that rather toxic hierarchy, a Neolithic bequest, everything was ensouled. Along comes the Enlightenment and reconceives the universe as a machine. And there's no place for a soul in a machine. You can see the moral consequences of that change. There's something obviously ethically dodgy about destroying something which is ensouled, about relocating that soul to another dimension. But there's nothing obviously dodgy about smashing up a machine. The hunter-gatherers that have composed most of our past would have been appalled to see the way that we have declared that animals don't have souls, that plants don't have souls. Remember the elaborate liturgical choreography which goes with hunter-gatherer living. it's quite hard to eat if you're a hunter-gatherer, because you know that any killing, any eating is a morally significant act, which requires oblation and satisfaction. The animal and even the plant needs to be asked for permission to be killed, needs to be thanked once it's done. Don't need to do that if the animal or the plant doesn't have a soul. So immediate ethical consequences, which echo still in our ecological catastrophes. I want to talk very briefly about another important way of looking at ecological crisis. I don't know if any of you have heard of the work of the psychiatrist and philosopher and author Ian McGilchrist. So Ian is famous for talking about the consequences of brain lateralization, hemispherical lateralization. All our brains are highly anatomically and functionally asymmetric, and indeed all nervous systems, even in annelid worms, as far back as we can see in evolutionary time, are asymmetric. And there's a very good reason for that. Imagine that a pigeon is pecking at little bits of grain on the ground immediately in front of it. In order to grasp the bit of grain, it's got to have a very narrow focused type of attention on the floor just in front of its face. But if it has only that type of attention, it's not going to survive to the next bit of grain, because it's going to be eaten by the fox, which is sitting in the bush. In order to see the fox, it's got to have a completely different and incompatible type of attention, a more holistic type of attention, a sort of attention which understands relationship and context. In humans, the narrow, nerdish type of attention is contributed by the left hemisphere. The wider, more holistic type of attention is contributed by the right hemisphere. We can see what happens if you have an imbalance of the types of attention which you get from these hemispheres from disease states. So if you have a massive tumour in or a stroke in your right hemisphere, and just have the narrow left hemispherical type of attention, what do you get? You see then the world not as a whole, but in parts. If you look at a human body, you will see 2 hands, 2 feet, 2 legs, but you won't see the relationship of the hands to the whole. The left hemisphere is extremely conservative. It's fond of its categories. It loves filing. It loves pigeonholing. It's extremely literal. It doesn't understand nuance. It doesn't understand that the meaning of a poem is to be read between the lines. It's often not there in the words itself. That's a right hemispherical function. But disastrously for us, the left hemisphere is in control of the grasping and manipulating right hand, just as the corresponding part of the pigeon's brain is responsible for that grain grasping beak. So we have the wrong sort of attention if the left hemisphere rules, governing the way that we manipulate the world. The left hemisphere is supposed to have an administrative, an executive, a secretarial function. It's supposed to be subservient to the right hemisphere, which is supposed to dictate the agenda of the organism. Let's describe the way that our ecological worries are playing out. We have people who are concerned with production, who love lists of figures, who see the value of things in terms of the amount of profit which can be produced, who deny the existence of anything which can't be proved with a spreadsheet. Familiar ecologically? I suspect so. Those are right hemispherical. Those are left hemispherical functions. We have, suggests McGilchrist, a usurpation of the functions of the right hemisphere by the left, and it's disastrous. You will also note that it's only the right hemisphere which is going to be the good storyteller. Imagine a story told by an organism which only had those left hemispherical functions. It wouldn't be a story, it would be a schedule. So, wrapping all this up, we are constitutionally what we have been for most of our evolutionary history. If you strip the suit off a banker in the City of London, you have a hunter-gathering caveman underneath. That's what we really are, and it gives me great hope, because if that's what we are, then that is what we can get back to easily. It's that core of ourselves which can be appealed to. We are storytelling creatures. That means that we need to couch our appeals, not, I suggest, in terms of graphs, statistics, not in terms of the 97% decline, but in terms of the individual story of the pathetic bird down the end of our road, to which we can relate. We relate to stories because we are stories ourselves. Tell stories, don't draw graphs. We need to re-ensoul the world. And if necessary, if we have been desouled by believing all the Enlightenment propaganda peddled by the left hemisphere, we need to do a bit of soul surgery on ourselves. So lots of you, I suspect, won't like the terms in which I put it, but the ecological crisis is a spiritual crisis. It's a crisis which indicates that, unlike children, we are not the natural animists that we grew up as a species to be. And we need to bring to our own lives and to our ecological efforts the sort of holistic attention which the right hemisphere can bring. Ecology, after all, is all about relationship. It's precisely relationship which is not understood by the left hemisphere, which has no part in the mechanistic world of the Enlightenment, which I've, yes, parodied, but I hope not terribly misrepresented. Let's re-enthrone the right hemisphere. Let's tell stories. Let's, yes, have our graphs, but make them subservient to our stories. I'll shut up, and you can tell me how radically misconceived all this is.
Oh, Charles, you're radically misconceived. But that was fascinating and again, a very moving presentation. But I do think it's a challenge, isn't it, in a very mechanistic world that we now do inhabit, to put a Shakespeare into a conservation project. How do you import that understanding of what it is to be human? And I'm completely in agreement with you, as you know. But nevertheless, we live in the world we live in, and the sort of language you're using is really, really powerful, but I can't see it in an AGM of, the RSPB.
We've got to become children again. And the best way of becoming children again is to is to start crawling around on actual or metaphorical all fours, just like real children do. Human children aren't bipeds, are they? Until quite late in their lives, they have then for that non-bipedal period a physical connection with the non-human world, which is very akin to the hunter-gatherer one that I've described, and which we've lost. So it is increasingly recognised that a tiny amount of exposure to the non-human world gives us all sorts of benefits. It not only reduces our blood pressure and our general sense of well-being, and reduces our rates of depression, and reduces the amount of time we need to recover from our operations, but also gives us a greater sense of self. So I'm cautiously optimistic that as the importance of that sort of connection is realised, the natural world will do its own work on even us sclerosed adults whose porosity has been diminished, and we've got to do far better in the education of our children. So we've got to start educating our children in a way which respects the right hemisphere.
Yeah, I agree with that more. So.
Yeah.
Charles, I'm going to ask both Beth and Barry to respond to what you've said. Barry is a sort of scientist working in the field. Beth is a social scientist. Beth, you first. Can you respond to what you've heard from Charles?
Yeah, thanks, Mary, and thanks, Barry and Charles, for your presentations. As you'd expect, I might be keen to respond to Charles's provocations around social science. Sort of two main points. I suppose the first thing I'd say is I'd say that I think the way that Charles perhaps painted social science is quite simplistic, and I'd say probably quite reductionist. It sort of simplifies what social science is. Social science is a huge range of different disciplines, but also worldviews, some of which I come from more of a qualitative perspective. And for example, I accept that humans are complex and act in complex ways, and that I would say there isn't one universal truth, certainly, about human behaviour, but people's worlds are socially constructed, and there's not one true perspective. And so I think there's all of the things Charles sort of railed against social science. I think we think about those things a lot, and there are benefits. You talked about graphs quite a lot. There are quantitative social scientists, of course. There are that sort of do big surveys and look at patterns in human behaviour and things. But actually, it's the bringing together of all those different worldviews, those different approaches, those different ways of understanding human beings and how they interact, which paints the picture that we need. And in terms of sort of the storytelling, again, I think it's slight misrepresentation. I've started doing an awful lot of work with artists and humanities scholars. I've put some links in the chat to some work we've done where social sciences can work very closely with the arts and humanities to better reveal and understand the ways that people feel about the world, think about the world, act in the world. And there's a paper in there actually by a colleague who was at DEFRA about the use of narrative in influencing policy. And we use creative methodologies such as storytelling to gather data and improve our understanding. Case studies is a key way that I communicate data and information to colleagues, policy colleagues and practice colleagues. And so we need it all. We need qualitative, quantitative, in-depth, the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences. And we need different approaches for different audiences, as Mary alluded to. There are certain ways that I will communicate information and questions that I will ask if I'm sitting there talking to some policy colleagues compared to talking to some farm advisor colleagues, compared to writing a paper, compared to sort of theorising around sort of the role of storytelling within the sort of social and cultural values. So, and actually really positively, I was on a webinar relatively recently with Sir Ian Diamond and Tamara Finkelstein, who's the permanent secretary for DEFRA, where they were really interested in understanding the role of qualitative social science. So a lot of the things that Charles was talking about in relation and how it plays a role in social science, how it plays a role in policy development. It's not just all about the numbers. And just finally, around in reflection of Barry's talk, I think it's really important, Barry, isn't it, to understand all of the different reasons why people manage the land the way they do, and those hard to reach people are often actually not hard to reach. It's just we maybe aren't using the right tools and the right channels to communicate with them. And I was on a webinar today with colleagues from the University of Edinburgh and Cambridge who've come up with a really great tool, which I'll link to in the chat, which sort of helps people, and including non-social scientists, work with, in this case they trialled it in Cumbria, the Cumbria Connect project, understanding the different perspectives and values that people had in relation to their landscapes, and sort of understanding where the commonalities, the synergies and the tensions were, and finding a way to move forward, acknowledging that there will always be those tensions, there will always be those different ways that we think that we should be managing the land, but actually there are ways to work through it. So I'll pop that in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. Barry, do you want to respond to Charles?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on a call with Mary Colwell, so I'm always going to meet interesting people, and I'm always happy to listen to a reflection. I mean, I wouldn't be sort of as challenging in terms of what Beth says, and I mean, it's not that I disagree with anything that was said. I'm sort of interested to hear what Charles has to say. It's very different from what I'm used to, so that's great. For I need to be able to be exposed and be challenged in terms of the way in which I do something, or the way in which we're working. And as I said at the finish, what I'm trying to achieve, or what we're trying to achieve, or maybe it's not just me, well, like, it's not working at the moment, so I have to listen to other narratives or other approaches. I mean, I think it really depends on the scale and the actual the objective of what you're trying to do. Okay, I'm in the business of generating knowledge which can underpin an evidence-based story, because if it's not an evidence-based story, well then, I'm not putting you in this glass at all, but you're in a Trumpian type world, and you're just telling stories about various different aspects. I think what I would harness what Charles is saying is that whatever you're doing in terms of, don't talk about a piece of information that might be relevant to a population, make it resonant, maybe to a family, or to a specific group of stakeholders that have got a particular part of their heart and mind that can be got at, if you like. And I think, both Beth and Charles are saying sort of the same thing in terms of the way in which the narratives are being put together, and what we're trying to achieve with that. I mean, I'm in the knowledge business, but by God, I'm interested in any way to harness the way in which that information can be used in a better way. I was sort of interested that you brought up Aristotle, because I really, it's the way in which sort of knowledge comes around, or information comes around, that, how many things are really new, because Charles, you're trained as a veterinarian. I'm sure you've heard of the One Health approach in terms of the integration of human health, animal health, plant health, ecosystem health, just in case some of the listeners haven't heard about this. And I mean, this is as old as, the first point in your talk this evening. I mean, this is just, we come from the integration of all of these different aspects. And this has been packaged by the WHO since 2008 to deal with challenges like pandemics and zoonotic emergence and new diseases and all the rest. But it's essentially just saying that we are all connected. And, it's that simple, if you like. And it's important actually to be aware of the fact that, a lot of what we do, maybe in my world, isn't as new as I'd like it to think that it is. but it's actually just maybe giving it in a new context, and that's where it is actually relevant to the story, because the context of the story is very, very relevant in terms of making sure that you hit with the right people in terms of the back to what you were saying before. And you know, back to that idea, we always talk about, you know, how people talk about farmers in general, and I'm just there going, Jesus, like, because I farm myself, and I help my uncle, and I can just tell you, farmers are the most heterogeneous category of individuals that I've ever come across. But that's because I don't study other people, and it goes back to Charles's original point, is that we're all very, very different, and we need to actually accept that. So, you know, getting a generic message is actually extremely difficult. So rather than actually challenge a lot of what you said, I'm sort of interested in seeing what I can harness.
Yeah, good. I mean, you can't have Charles Foster on a call and not be challenged. So, Charles, have you got anything to respond to both Beth and Barry before we go to the chat?
Just briefly, if I may, yes. Beth, you're absolutely right. What I said about social sciences was a parody. That was, I promise, an artifact of the time I had to talk about social sciences. Narrative, for example, in my own field of medical ethics, is a crucial tool, and is dealt with in a very rigorous way. I would say, though, that my clear impression from a lot of academic colleagues is that the qualitative people tend to see themselves and tend to be seen by the quantitative people as the poor cousins. And I suspect that is a consequence of this left brain bias, which I've talked about. Barry, I'm absolutely not, and I know you didn't say that I was, I'm absolutely not against science. Yes, of course, we need all the data we can get. All that I was saying was how we use all that data to change hearts and minds. But because of the sorts of animals we are, I think that we can't do that by playing the left hemisphere's own game. Yes, get all the science there, but once it's there, change the world by translating it into story. Only when that's done will people's guts be moved, and only if their guts are moved will their hands move to their credit cards.
Yeah. Yes. Can I just, I was at a conference a year or so ago. I think I've said this a couple of times actually, but I did say to the scientists in the room, it was a WADA conference. We just had 2 or 3 days of very heavy science and very depressing science on WADA declines. But as you say, Charles, you come out of them feeling remarkably sort of unscathed by the horror that you've just heard. And so I asked people if they would rewrite the summary, the abstract of their paper, but only use words that are used in poems, and see if they could do it. And 1 or 2 tried. It was actually a very interesting thing to do. So yeah. I throw that challenge out to you, Barry. Your last paper, will you send it to us in poetic language and see if it has a different feel when you do that?
Which one? The one that I just.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, whatever.
Well, there's one that I've just got that's nearly gone, and it's basically. Yeah, I'll deal with that one because it's more. It's more in my head as a piece of science now than the other one. I'd have to sort of go back and dig through that, but it might take me a week or 2.
No, it doesn't matter when, but it would be interesting to see it at some point when you've got time.
There's one other quick point I want, because I just happened to mention this to a group of students this morning. I remember talking to Jim Scudamore, who was involved in trying to manage the foot and mouth crisis in 2001, and he said subsequently he would much rather have dealt with qualitative data rather than the quantitative data that he was handling in terms of making policy decisions. So I have absolutely, from a policy point of view, I have no snobbery in relation to that. You're absolutely right, Charles. As academics, we go, oh, we must have the best, quantitative deterministic model we can possibly produce, that needs to be translated by 5 different people before it can be put into common language. Whereas in actual fact, when you're in a crisis mode, you want categories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mary, perhaps I could just make one very quick point. There's a paradoxical effect, which says that the greater the threat, the less effect it will have on us. And I think this is shown, for example, in our reaction to climate change and mass extinction. The way that those awful threats are presented to us, in terms of horrific statistics, is simply too great for us to grasp. Again, this might be a left hemispherical thing. It may be that the left hemisphere doesn't have a pigeonhole big enough to accommodate the idea of a threat that big, and therefore discounts the whole thing. So it may be that your efforts on behalf of Curlews would be more appealing to the grant-giving public if the figure was a 25% decline rather than 97% decline, and that may have an effect on the way that we couch the stories. But it may be something to do with the phenomenon of compassion fatigue. It may be something to do with simple cognitive overload when we're bombarded by all the statistics which relate to these horrific existential threats. But whatever the reason, we do seem to go emotionally numb and therefore financially inert when we're confronted with really serious challenges. We just freeze.
No, I agree. And if anyone's watched the film that I just seen recently in Bristol called Sing Sing, which is a fascinating film about prisoners in a high security prison in America, and they come together and develop a very strong and humanitarian approach to their imprisonment through drama. And one of them said, how do you go to a play? I mean, you get a Shakespeare play and you're expected to perform it. And they said, it's so overwhelmingly huge, you can't do it. There's too much in it. And this guy said, well, you don't eat an elephant all at once, do you? You eat it a little bit at a time. And I think that's probably, take that analogy into conservation. No, we can't take on global mass extinctions. Nobody can. But you can get involved locally, and which is why local conservation, what's happening on your doorstep, on your street, down in the local park, that's what really matters. And which is why the GCSE in natural history would, if it ever happens, is so vital, because it will get kids looking at what's on their doorstep. And once you have that engagement, and if we can make it not just a scientific, which we need to, and data engagement, but also an emotional engagement through the arts and culture, then I think we're going to start changing things. But we're rapidly running out of time. Megan, could you quickly just give us a couple of reflections from the chat and ask the panel to respond to them?
Well, I was going to jump on to the natural history GCSE, but you got there before me.
Oh,
so
sorry about that.
kind of stole that away from me and from the commentators. Keith made a really interesting point. His question was, how do we appeal to our inner storyteller in the age of AI? Which I thought was really interesting one to bring up.
Beth, do you want to have a go at that one first?
Oh, crikey.
Or if you want to have a think about
I don't
it.
know if I'm the best person to talk about AI, to be honest.
Who wants to pitch in first on that one?
Well, I just make the trite and rather obvious comment that AI is not intelligent. It's artificial unintelligence. It's an accumulation of lots of little data using using an over-pixelated view of the world, which isn't all brought together in that holistic right hemispherical way. I know I'm overusing that phrase in order to form a coherent whole. And so I think that we have to reform our cultural diets. We've got to find that big button which presumably exists somewhere in the world which turns the internet off, and press it to switch it off. We need to wean ourselves away from dependence on all the overwhelming types of uncurated information that bombard us. So we've got to look at our own intellectual and cultural diets in exactly the same way that we look at our physical diets, by looking at what's on the packaging, and deciding only to have organic, free-range information.
Yeah. I just think there's one. Charles hit on the point, is that it's not designed to hit the emotions in terms of a tool. I think maybe if you're saying how would you use it, you could use it as a start, but then you'd need to edit it and put in that poetry that you were talking about in terms of to make it resonate with individuals. That's my amateurish approach to the tool. But my initial sense is that how can you expect something to be emotionally and sort of have a sense and have a connection when it doesn't actually come from there?
Yeah.
No, well put. Beth,
I did have, I just sort of, Charles and Barry were speaking. I was thinking, I have got colleagues that are very interested in this, and I do think I think we need to start now thinking about how we use AI as evidence, because there will be increasingly more and more push towards sort of the idea that AI can just produce the evidence we need for, and I think it can be really useful, and I think it's increasingly being used by researchers, but I think there needs to be sort of very careful thinking through, but from social scientists, from ethicists, from natural scientists, about under what circumstances we use it and how we use it mindfully. So yeah.
One last comment from the chat, if there is. Well, there's lots of comments in the chat. Anything that came up? We've had more comments in the chat for this one I think we've ever had before, which has been fabulous. Megan, anything?
It has been very busy in the chat. Philip brought up a good point, saying we really are talking to ourselves. Charles is right, but the question is how to communicate this with the wider world. People need to stroke a dead curlew, hopefully not too many dead curlews, at the end of the road, then their humanity will be enabled! !
Quite right.
I think I think you're right. It is about connecting with people on an emotional level. I think we have to be a little bit careful. We don't assume that we just need more people to think how we think. And I think that has been a bit of a danger in the conservation movement in the past, is that, we're right. This is how it should be. We just need to shout louder at you so that you accept what I'm saying is true. And that hasn't worked. And I think what social science does is it uses evidence. It systematically looks at how people think that way, why they think the way they do, perhaps things that we haven't considered, and actually gives us a path forward to actually working with, not just dismissing differences of opinion, but working with them and sort of finding a way to take account of the different experiences, attitudes, values, barriers, enablers people experience when they're going about their day-to-day lives. So yeah, I've got a little bit careful of not just shouting louder at people.
Absolutely. Unless anybody's got anything to say, all I can say, we're at 8 o'clock, and I promised you we'd finish at 8 o'clock. We could go on from the 2. I've got a million questions that I'd like to ask. There's been some really, really interesting stuff in the chat. People very engaged, and thank you so much, everybody. That will be available for everyone to look at later. But on behalf of Curlew Action, I can't thank Charles, Barry and Beth enough for their time tonight, and for you for being so engaged in the audience. Please spread this webinar far and wide. Barry and I have been talking about this stuff quite a lot recently, and we really do need to get much more of the human soul into conservation. If we're going to win this battle, and we have to win this battle, then we need to fight with our souls as well as our minds. So thank you, everybody, and it's been a fascinating evening, as I knew it would be. And we'll see you for the next one, which is in, Megan, have you got the date there?
I did. It's mid-October.
It's mid-October. We'll send lots of webinars, but it's all about a roundup of this year's breeding season in the UK. So there you go, get your hankies out. It's not all bad news, but yeah. So we'll have a roundup from around the UK of how curlews have done this year. And I can give you a bit of a spoiler alert. It's been great in some places and not so great in others. But hey, what's new? Okay, thank you, everybody. And we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.